Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR Newstalk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Is the end of the 18-year war in Afghanistan in sight? Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. The Taliban have announced a nationwide temporary ceasefire during which a peace agreement could be signed with the United States. The U.S. currently has around 12,000 troops in the country, but during its time in Afghanistan, the U.S. lost some 2,400 troops, with thousands more suffering from the after effects of their service there. So what went wrong? Why has the U.S. been in the country for nearly 2 decades? The Washington Post recently published what it called the Afghanistan Papers. It's drawn from a study by the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction titled Lessons Learned. And the $11 million study conducted interviews with 600 people compiling some 2,000 pages. On the phone with us this morning is Anthony Cordesman. He's with the Center for Strategic and International Studies based in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So let me just first of all begin with the latest news, which is a ceasefire. Apparently has been declared, at least approved by the Taliban Council. And there's a lot of talk about some kind of peace deal, perhaps the U.S. pulling out. What do you make of that flurry of recent news?
Well, this is actually a process of negotiation that's been going on for several years and which has culminated really in about a year of effort. The problem is it defines a temporary ceasefire. There's been no public statement of what the peace terms would be, what role the Taliban would play in the Afghan government, and no one knows what the Afghan government will be because there's been an election which has not produced a clear result, and where there is even more bitterness and division between the two main candidates than the last time. There's been no definition of what role the United States would play, if any, in continuing to provide aid or security guarantees if the Taliban broke the terms of any agreement. And again, it's important to stress, there's been no public statement of what the agreement would be, and whether it would guarantee any of the rights that have gradually at least made some progress, like the rights of women, the rule of law, efforts to limit corruption. All of these issues are kind of left hanging, waiting to see if you can actually negotiate any kind of peace settlement. And usually when you have any kind of ceasefire, you have an agreement as to what the peace is going to be first. At least what the ceasefire would be on any lasting basis. Here, we really don't know anything about how this is going to end.
Do you see any kind of reconciliation between the Afghan government on the one hand that the U.S. produced and the Taliban on the other?
Well, as yet, there has been no reconciliation. Technically speaking, the Taliban has moved to the point where it will at least talk to the Afghan government. But it's important to note that technically speaking, there is not an Afghan government. The people holding office have held office now long after their elected terms. No one knows how this is going to work out because no one knows what the results of the recent election are going to be. There are certainly deep factional divisions within Afghanistan, so when we talk about the government of Afghanistan, it's a government of about half the country, and sometimes it's the government of what people call Kabulistan, after the capital, rather than the Afghan government. So all of these uncertainties are critical, and there's a tendency to ignore them. And it's one that's very dangerous because this is a country which exists largely because of outside aid, military and civilian. it can't finance the government it has to the extent it has a government. And to the extent that its military forces can survive, they have been almost completely dependent on U.S. ground advisors and U.S. air power.
So where did this thing go wrong? I mean, as I could have looked back at 9/11, Afghanistan was clearly a response to that. And it's almost as if Osama bin Laden opened up a trap. That is to say that the United States, at least it seemed to feel as if it had no recourse except to invade the country, which then made the Taliban the enemy, amongst other things, and that the mission became rather obscure in terms of actually finding Osama bin Laden, which was the actual object.
Well, I think a lot of what you say is perfectly true. The problem you have is the history really is extremely erratic. We went in with very small forces and air power. We basically tied ourselves to a northern alliance which was still fighting the Taliban. The Taliban had no ability to resist American air power, and the unlimited number of American ground advisors, which included many special forces and people from the CIA, were able to organize the Northern Alliance forces to drive the Taliban out and push it across into Pakistan. Now, one of the problems was that bin Laden and many of the forces that were involved basically made it to Pakistan. Another problem was that others dispersed. It was really hard to say after the Taliban government broke up who was really a supporter of the Taliban. The United States was confronted with a deeply divided country because the Northern Alliance did not speak for or include large numbers of people from the major faction in Afghanistan, which were the Pashtuns. And you had an economy in almost total collapse, a government basically that didn't really function in the normal sense. It didn't provide basic medical or educational or other services. So we walk into a power vacuum. Now, initially, the Taliban was so disrupted, there was no military resistance, but all of a sudden, the United States was confronted with nation building. And the nation we tried to build, in many ways, was a copy of ourselves. We tried to leap from essentially a semi-feudal tribal structure to a modern democratic government by passing a constitution, which we in many ways drafted. It had many deep errors in it. We had a foreign aid program, but nobody really knew enough about Afghanistan to plan one. And we didn't pay a lot of attention to creating effective Afghan forces for the first few years because the Taliban had been so thoroughly disrupted. And then, remember, this is 2001, 2002. And in 2003, we invaded Iraq. Now, this is something the Post doesn't pay any attention to, and frankly, in fairness to the Special Inspector General and the lead Inspector General, their reports do pay attention to it. But once we became involved in Iraq, we were suddenly faced with a far more serious problem and a much quicker rise of an opposition force. That led to a focus on Iraq to the exclusion in many ways of a focus on Afghanistan. And so roughly between 2003 and really 2006, 2007, the Taliban kind of came back while we kept trying to essentially transform Afghanistan into something that it simply wasn't ready to be transformed into. When the Taliban did come back, we were simply not in a position to provide the trainers and aid necessary to create an effective Afghan force. So for years, we relied on our own forces and NATO allies. That takes us really up to somewhere about 2012. Then we went from having the impression of having won in Iraq in 2011 to a surge. We, in the process, created a massive aid program, but it was extremely unstable, basically changing every year. And the president announced a deadline for leaving. Well, the problem with that deadline was we couldn't possibly create effective Afghan forces in the time that was left. And it told the Taliban if they simply waited, the U.S. would be withdrawing most of its combat forces. And again, this is not covered well in the Post, but every year from about 2014 through about 2017, we kept changing tactics, withdrawing forces, altering the force mix. We basically let the civil aid, the nation-building efforts, almost vanish. It looks like a mountain of rising aid up to about 2013, and then all of a sudden the mountain ends and falls down into a valley and almost disappears. And this structure had no continuity. Now, people who are listening to this broadcast who are old enough will remember that one of the slogans in Vietnam, because every year we rotated, changed policies, was that every year in Vietnam was the first year in Vietnam. And if you look at the programs, the funding profiles, the tactics, the way we tried to build up the government and Afghan forces, one problem was that this cycle of rapid rotations meant every year was the first year in Afghanistan. Now, basically, we don't advise the Afghan security forces that are police or paramilitary. We concentrate on advancing the army and trying to develop that using advisors now, which are forward, not simply in the rear, but there are very few of them, and we rely basically on massive numbers of U.S. airstrikes to give the Afghan army the ability to defend the population centers, because it can't defend much of the countryside.
Let me ask you this. Going back, it seems to me that to a large extent, one of the basic flaws was that on the one hand, we, as you said, drew up this sort of U.S.-style kind of constitution, at least the concepts. On the other hand, we were very dependent upon the warlords, which created its own constituency, and it was certainly not compatible with this ideal constitution.
Well, it certainly wasn't compatible, but the Constitution, frankly, was ridiculous. We made the same mistake in Iraq. Instead of creating a constitution where people voted for representatives, they voted for national lists. The idea was this would get around all of the tribal and sectarian differences. And warlords were only a limited part of the problem. Generally, the problem wasn't warlords, it was power brokers and drug retailers. But the legislature had no real power over money, and it didn't really represent anybody. The role of Karzai and to some extent Ghani was not simply to deal with warlords, which were a problem mostly in the north, but the whole host of power brokers and sectarian and ethnic leaders. And in one city, for example, like Kandahar, you ended up with 12 rival factions in the city, and they weren't even basically divided by tribe or sect or ethnicity. You had no coherent structure for governance, and you had no control over money. And this, I think, is another key issue, and it is raised often in the outside criticisms by the Special Inspector and others. inspector generals as well as the post, you created a level of corruption which to Americans is almost unimaginable. We know of a lot of low-level corruption. We don't think of it as consuming perhaps 20% of the entire economy. And in Afghanistan, corruption was so great that it basically took over much of the country.
In terms of that aid, it seemed to me that one of the things that happens is that there is, I think, and you alluded to a moment ago, that there is so much aid, so much money flowing in, probably not as many projects as perhaps were appropriate, and there was no way to figure out how to get that aid effectively to build those projects without a lot of it just simply being siphoned off.
Well, part of the problem, frankly, was that we hadn't engaged in any kind of serious nation building for decades. So USAID and the State Department basically concentrated on two types of aid. One was project aid, which didn't really reform or change the economy. And the country was divided up into districts where every major ally ran their own aid program. In theory, it was to be coordinated by the UN, but the UN never really tried to coordinate this aid. And we didn't have consistent patterns. We had very low-level aid, and as it became apparent that there were serious problems, we just had a massive rise in funding, and this is shown in a lot of the graphs in the Special Inspector General's report. And then just about 2012, 2013, we slashed the programs without really having planned ways to terminate them. And a lot of the money was wasted on really ineffective efforts to do things like prevent the growing of narcotics. When you look at how these funding profiles related to what actually got done, the other issue was that you didn't really have an effort to control the money. I think people rushed to try to accomplish as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and the end result was they made the funding almost too easy to steal, to misuse, to misallocate, or waste. It was only really after General McChrystal came there and then General McMaster began to do a study of how bad the contracting procedure was. And this is more than a decade after we went into the country, that people noticed how bad the funding and contract control was, and we left before we had the ability to actually implement the reforms in that contracting process.
One of the other issues that's taken up, particularly in terms of the papers that the Washington Post published, was the issue of opium, which apparently under the Taliban had almost been wiped out, but then came surging back. Tell me a little bit about that and what seemed to be a lot of contradictions in how we approached Afghanistan.
Well, I think one problem to understand is there was exactly 1 year that the Taliban really seriously cut back on opium. And it did so as much because the previous year, under Taliban rule, the flood of opium into the world market had depressed the price as any great moral crusade. The fact was that opium was virtually the only major export of Afghanistan. It was the only way that farmers could actually get a cash crop. There wasn't the distribution or food processing to handle a lot of the things that they grew normally and that were food products, and sort of earn money from markets outside an incredibly poor Afghanistan. And we tried everything. We tried to find alternative crops. We tried to destroy the opium poppy crops that were grown. We created anti-drug forces. But the basic problem was that when this is the only way to get real money. And when people, quite aside from the farmers, have every incentive to become drug dealers, particularly not only the Taliban, but the power brokers, a lot of these efforts to stop opium growing simply defied virtually every economic incentive in the country.
Do you think that that there was any way for the United States to accomplish its mission, or to keep its mission from creeping, as it were, from essentially searching for Osama bin Laden to the nation building of Afghanistan?
I don't think that there was ever any chance, and we're seeing this in Iraq right now, that we could transform Afghanistan from a country that had basically been involved in civil conflicts since the late 1970s into anything approaching a modern state. If we had basically tried to use the Northern Alliance, rely on the real structure of power, create a legislature that had some ability to represent and control money, and if we had actually created any kind of effective international system to allocate much more limited levels of aid in the areas which were most needed, we might at least have brought stability. If we had basically seriously tried to resource the creation of effective Afghan forces rather than deploy a mix of our own forces and allied forces, and done that early on, we might have created a force that could actually have defended at least the major population centers. But I think, and this puts it in perspective, I think, for at least some of you listeners, you have to remember this was one, and is one, of the poorest countries in the world. We normally think of poverty in terms of countries like Bangladesh, but Bangladesh is rich compared to Afghanistan. We're talking tremendous levels of dire poverty, affecting 30 to 40% of the population. We're talking a country which war has forced to urbanize in areas where there's no industry and there are no real jobs, and where young men basically can't find employment and women aren't allowed to. We're talking about a structure where if you want to earn a modern living, you almost have to be corrupt and deal with the power brokers. And if you're going to deal with a country like this, you don't try to transform it quickly. You move it very slowly and according to its own capabilities and priorities. And even then, when you look at countries like Afghanistan that are that poor, you find that basically many of them have had terrible development records for decades and haven't been able to deal with peacetime, much less war, conflict in a neighbor like Pakistan. And I think it's important to point out that throughout this, Pakistan basically supported the Taliban, while it simultaneously claimed to be helping the United States reach a peace settlement. A problem which, to go back to your original questions, one of the great difficulties here is nobody has said a word about what Pakistan's role has been in this peace settlement.
Is there any way to deal with Pakistan in terms of the kind of government that would then be formed in Afghanistan as we go ahead? What kind of influence they have in terms of how it's going to look?
I think it's in many ways too late. Originally, there was some very hard negotiating. And there were, to put it simply, statements that you're either with us or against us. And then we provided very high levels of military aid to a military-dominated Pakistan. That bought time, but it never basically bought support. Pakistan was far more interested in ensuring that India didn't gain influence in Pakistan, that it maintained control over its western border, that it didn't have to accept the boundary with Pakistan, which is not one Pakistan accepts. And if we had leverage, we had it early on. Once we announced that we were leaving, which of course we didn't really completely do, we didn't just send signals to the Taliban. We told Pakistan basically that we weren't going to be there and we weren't going to be able to put real pressure on Pakistan.
Ultimately, do you see the United States pulling out within the next few years?
I think that the way we are going, if the Taliban can find the unity to actually reach a peace agreement, I think we're going to learn the hard way that peace negotiations are often a form of war by other means. The Taliban will inherit some kind of role formally in governing at the local level, probably over about half the country, although not the most populated part. It will have to be given ministries and roles inside the government, and it will not have to effectively disarm because, frankly, in a country where everyone basically who's male and under 40 has an AK-47 or its equivalent, you're not going to disarm the Taliban under any conditions. They basically will have considerable advantages in transforming this peace into at least some level of control over much of the country. Now, since we don't know the terms of the peace, we don't know what protections or safeguards are going to be involved, if any. We don't know if the U.S. is guaranteeing prolonged military aid to what emerges as an Afghan government. And of course, we also have the minor problem that, legally speaking, at this point in time, there is no Afghan government, at least one that's accepted by at least a safe majority of the people. So you have the oddity that the Taliban is essentially negotiating with the U.S., which is to some extent excluded the titular head of the Afghan government, President Ghani, from much of these negotiations. And kind of in trying to predict this future, well, it's a bit difficult.
We were speaking with Anthony Cordesman. He's with the Center for Strategic and International Studies based in Washington, D.C., and we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us this morning.
A pleasure. Thank you.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Ranck. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. You can also watch Delmarva Today on PAC 14 by tuning into Comcast Channel 14 or youtube.com/PAC 14.